Well, it has been 4 years since the Taliban swept back to power in Afghanistan, and some of the worst fears about their return have indeed come true, especially for the country's women and girls. They've issued dozens of directives stripping them of their rights, even the most basic, linked to education, employment, and presence in public spaces. And though the international community had issued condemnation after condemnation, it's translated to few impactful, concrete actions. For more, Fereshta Abbasi joins us for perspective. She's an Afghanistan researcher with Human Rights Watch. Fereshta, thank you very much for joining us today. So I was wondering if you could just kind of start by painting a general picture for what life looks like for women and girls in general. And is it uniform across the country, or are there more or less restrictions depending on the region?
Thank you so much for hosting me. As we're speaking ahead of a very grim anniversary, the fourth anniversary of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan was 15th of August 2025, a few days earlier. It's a very dark anniversary, and at the same time, it shapes a very grim picture of Afghanistan right now. In 2025, Afghanistan remains to be the only country in the world where its women and girls do not have access to secondary and higher education. Women face severe restriction in accessing employment in Afghanistan. They don't have the right to freedom of movement, no freedom of assembly. And all of these are happening in parallel to an ongoing humanitarian crisis. The UN has recently announced that 22.7 million Afghans, which is more than half of Afghanistan's population, is going to face food insecurity by the end of this year. And there is very little funding available for the humanitarian response plan. In very basic words, it means that Afghans are going to starve this year, especially as we're getting closer to winter. You asked whether these restrictions are unified. The ban on education is unified. The restrictions on women's employment are unified. This is happening across the country, including the big cities like Kabul, which is the capital, Herat, Mazar, but also in the villages of Afghanistan. And you've probably heard that a couple of days ago, the Taliban leader have issued another advisory opinion. We are still trying to see to what extent they're going to implement it, but women are no longer allowed to attend madrasas or religious school, which was open previously.
There had been sporadic women-led protests in Afghanistan since the Taliban's return. What remains of that movement?
So, as I said, women do not have the right to freedom of assembly in Afghanistan anymore, which means that they cannot protest the way that they used to on the streets right after the takeover. But they haven't given up. They're still continuing. They have changed the way that they're protesting. So you still have female protesters in the country who are covering their faces, who speak at international conferences, who record themselves and protest to the ongoing situation. And with that, I really would like to applaud the brave and courageous Afghan women in the country who are still resisting and who are still fighting and who are still hopeful for a better future in the country.
If we try to imagine a post-Taliban Afghanistan, Fereshta, is there any viable political opposition to speak of? Anyone that you could imagine, even if it's in its early phases, ruling a post-Taliban Afghanistan?
There's currently no threat to the Taliban's status quo, and I think, there's a lot of reason for that. If we could imagine a post-Taliban or a better future for Afghanistan, I would see women of Afghanistan being heavily involved in that, because I think one thing that's quite true is to say that Afghan women are currently leading the resistance against the Taliban. If there is one resistance force in Afghanistan right now, that's definitely the women of Afghanistan. And they're not only fighting for their own rights, they're fighting for an equal future, they are fighting for a better future for Afghanistan. So if we can imagine a better Afghanistan and a better future, definitely Afghan women will be leading that.
Earlier this year, the International Criminal Court, of course, issued arrest warrants for the Taliban Supreme Leader and the Taliban Chief Justice for their involvement in gender persecution, which is, of course, a crime against humanity. Has that had any impact concretely at all?
I think that sends a very hopeful message to women of Afghanistan who are still fighting in the country. That accounts to be one of the biggest achievements for accountability in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country that has not had, the cycle of immunity in Afghanistan has been ongoing for for more than 4 decades. So the International Criminal Court identifying perpetrators within the Taliban leaders and issuing arrest warrants for them means that the Taliban cannot do all what they're doing in Afghanistan without being held accountable. I think that's a significant step, and women in the country have also reacted to that. We see very hopeful messages coming from the country after the ICC issuing arrest warrants.
Speaking of holding the Taliban accountable, I mean, do you think that they are still as isolated on the world stage as they were in 2021? Or do you see the international community as having kind of tacitly accepted their rule by failing to kind of push them harder on rights abuses?
Unfortunately, we see very harmful practices of normalizing engagement with the Taliban. I mean, earlier this year, a couple of months ago, we saw Russia recognizing the Taliban. We've also seen some countries moving toward normalization of engagement with the Taliban. I mean, very harmful practices. For example, Germany has announced that they're going to have technical engagement with the Taliban over deportation of Afghan refugees. We have heard that Switzerland have just hosted 4 Taliban diplomats in Switzerland for deportation of refugees. So I do believe that this is extremely harmful for a regime that is committing crimes against humanity of gender persecution, that has allegedly committed other international crimes. In that sense, I would say that they are not as isolated as they were in 2021, and there are a normalization of engagement with the Taliban from the international community, unfortunately.
We just have less than a minute left, Fereshta, but I just want to ask one last question. I mean, what kind of actions from the international community do you think would make a difference without further endangering Afghan women, men, and children, especially as it confronts multiple humanitarian crises?
There's an appeal by the Afghan civil society at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva calling on the Human Rights Council member state, but especially EU, which is the pin holder for Afghanistan's resolution, to establish a dedicated accountability mechanism for Afghanistan. Basically, this international independent mechanism will be able to prepare case files for those who are responsible for the ongoing abuses, past and ongoing abuses in Afghanistan. I think that's the least that international community, especially EU countries, can do right now. Victims deserve justice everywhere, and there's a huge gap for documentation in Afghanistan. And I do believe that this mechanism is going to add, a lot of value to Afghanistan. It will pave the way forward for future accountability in Afghanistan. And this is extremely needed because the UN Human Rights Council in similar situations like Syria and Iraq has mandated this accountability mechanism. And we're really hoping that in the next Human Rights Council session, which is in September, the EU will propose a technical proposal to the UN Human Rights Council to establish this mechanism for Afghanistan.
Fereshta Abbasi, researcher with Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for your time today.